Good morning, and very much welcome to Finanspanelen, the finance panel, the first finance panel of the decade, the roaring 20s. And we will end, or start this decade a little bit on the same note as we ended the last one, talking about the ECB, monetary policy. We talked on banking union, the last thing we did last year. And to guide us through the questions that are concerning the ECB right now, we are very proud and honored to have Peter Praet here, coming all the way up to Stockholm. Peter Praet has been a member of the executive board of the ECB and also the chief economist of the European Central Bank. And as before that held position at the Fortis Bank, the Belgian Ministry of Finance, the National Bank of Belgium, and been at the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, and at the same time has been a professor of monetary economics at the Solvay Business School of Economics and Management. So very experienced and very knowledgeable in all these areas. So, and I think I will leave it to you to introduce the topic and what you are going to talk about. So Peter Praet, please, the floor is yours.
So, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. And really, there is always something to learn in Sweden, since a long time, I know that. And I had a lot of relations before I entered central banking even, with not only Sweden, but Norway, but basically countries that went through, a banking crisis. So that's how I met. He told me to put the microphone there, but I think it's the opposite, no? I think I should keep some distance. But so I really think also in monetary policy there's a lot to learn, and there have been recent decisions by the central bank where I must confess I had sympathy with the decision which was taken. It's not an easy decision, of course, and it's difficult sometimes to explain because the worry that came is not so much. Well, the worry is basically low for long and negative for a very long period of time of interest rates. So it has been discussed very much, and we can come back on this later on if you want. I will be at the central bank later today. So the topic today is basically on the limits of monetary policy, as a sort of question marks. And I basically take 3 points on this topic. The first one, when you think about the limits, may be that one expects too much from monetary policy in general. One expects too much. We know that monetary policy plays an important role, a dominant role, a key role in stabilization policy. Is that true in all circumstances? For example, if you think there will be war tomorrow, you can cut the interest rates as much as you want. You can try to ease financial conditions. It's unlikely to reestablish, business sentiment and consumer sentiment in general. So that's an extreme case, of course. But the last shock that we had, the geopolitical shock, I was of the opinion that monetary policy could do not much, to try to compensate, for the impact of these uncertainties, new uncertainties on the business cycle, for example, just to illustrate that. So my first point is one expects too much from monetary policy, so the limits are basically related to, what do you expect from monetary policy? And very often there is over the many years, and especially during the last, I would say, decade, a bit more maybe than a decade, there was this sort of feeling that monetary policy would follow some rule, let's say just a sort of Taylor rule. But in the Taylor rule, the nature of the shock, the horizon, and all these things are absent of that. The Taylor rule, if you look after, exposed, works relatively well. But I was always struck by the simplicity of people saying, stabilization policy, the primary responsibility for stabilization is the central bank, and it follows some simple rule. My experience, it's quite, and especially the last 10 years, it's quite different from that. So that's the first one. I will go a little bit further, but the second one is the instrument question, and the third one is a little bit the specificity of the euro area. So there are the limits of monetary policy. So first, do you expect too much from monetary policy? So there is a sort of expectation gap. The second will be a question of instrument. The question of instrument has now dominated the debate. And it's basically related to what we call the natural rate of interest rate. What is the neutral rate of interest? So you know that central banks try to influence financial conditions by influencing the money markets, because that's where they have a monopoly on the money market. And by doing that, they can also influence expectations about future interventions of the central bank on the money market. I mean, basically, that's what we do usually, traditionally in central bank. So what you try when the economy doesn't work well, you try to put the rates, the official rate, the central bank rate, below the natural rate, so the neutral rate, and that stimulates the economy. It's a very simple, simplistic sort of framework. Theoretical. It's not so difficult to explain to people in general, but the natural rate is a bit difficult. I call it the neutral rate, where the economy would basically work at potential. There is no output gap, and inflation is more or less a target. And that would be the normal rate, in normal circumstances. I tried to explain, monetary policy in less a technical way. That's a little bit how I would try to explain to relatively educated people, because when you go to the population, it's a challenge to explain what monetary policy does. And it will come back in the strategic review, your discussion, what I say now. But the instrument is a key question, because we have seen, and there is a sort of consensus now, that the natural rate has been trending down over the years, over decades now. So the normal rate has been trending down. The real rate has been trending down over, some people say centuries, some other people will say at least 30 years, for different reasons. Come back very quickly on this. And so you hit at some point the zero, what we call the zero lower bound. So what do you do when the natural rate is zero and you want to stimulate the economy? So you have to do something. You have to go negative or try to influence expectations about the future short-term rates, what you are going to do, etc., etc. What we call non-standard measures, you start doing that. So once you hit the lower bound, the zero, what do you do? Has been, of course, a situation in which central bankers are used to in recent times, after the financial crisis. The difference now in the debate is that more or less the consensus among central bankers is that this situation could get even worse to some extent. Wow. And that it's going to be lasting for a long period of time. That's new. And that leads to the strategic decision. What do you do for the next recession in the United States? That's the debate today. So the third one, and I go through very quickly the 3 points, but is the specialness of the euro area. Because we have a monetary union, that means that monetary policy is centralized, but of course fiscal policy is decentralized. And if you think about the two previous points, and you think that stabilization policy can not only be the only responsibility of the central bank, you have, of course, a coordination problem, because you need other actors to intervene. And how do you do in a decentralized framework? By the way, where the room of maneuver of many, many countries is quite limited, of course. And so how do you do with that? It's also the specialness of the euro is also in terms of non-conventional instruments. If you want to do QE and buy government bonds, you deal with plenty different countries with different debt, situations. Some super safe asset like the Bund, and some not so super safe or even considered as risky assets. I will not mention countries, but a number of countries will not qualify. And that means that the central bank is in an awkward position when it wants to do QE and buy assets on the market. What do you buy, actually? So I will come back to that too. Also, I think the lesson we have, especially in the euro area, when we say monetary policy cannot do it alone, it's not only that you think about fiscal, it's also because to be efficient, monetary policy needs to be supported by other institutions. A very simple example, the whatever it takes of Mario Draghi was very important, of course, a very important signal that changed the market sentiment and just stopped the panic that you had. But on the other hand, you should also consider that the whatever it takes of Mario would not have worked without the June, I think there was a June Council of Head of State and Government deciding to go ahead with the banking union and the sovereign debt issue by putting in place the European Stability Mechanism there. So it worked because there were some institutional changes with strong political signals before, and also the fact that what Mario said was also backed, by politicians in general in Europe. So not only in their attitude, but also in the institutional reform. So there is a symbiotic relationship. Well, when it works, I mean, for monetary policy to work, you need to have, the other policies working, and that we, especially in Europe, in the euro area, of course. So when I go back to the 3 points, and then I go in the strategic review, one expects too much of monetary policy. So I repeat a little bit some of the things, but. So central banks are not omnipotent, so that's a very important communication for the public. I think for markets as well, but markets understand that better. The public, this is a danger. When I will talk about the strategic review, when I'm saying that, is one has to be careful when you start discussing the mandate. And as you know, in your area, the primary mandate is price stability, of course. But to the extent that this object is not compromised, you can support other economic policies. That means everything. That may be climate change, and then when you communicate like the new president, Christine, I think it's noble. I mean, I think it's true. But one has to be careful about that because you create expectations about what a central bank can do. And one has to, control these expectations very much. And when you say it's a critical mission, you can also say it's mission creep. Is it critical mission or mission creep? And I think the two are true. It's a question of how do you do it in practice and what are the signals you communicate. But you have to be very careful about this. I read in Bloomberg this morning that, I don't know if it's true or not true, but a letter was sent by the president of the ECB to the governing council members saying to be careful in their communication about the strategic review, not because the purpose is to bring some order in the debate and not to bring chaos in the debate. That means that when individual governors, speak now, as has been the case recently, you better be careful and not preempt, a debate which has not yet started. I'm now independent, so I can do that, but I still will be careful because I left only 6 months ago and it's a little bit close still to my previous job, so I will be a bit careful. So, for example, on climate change and monetary policy, I will tell you my opinion, but I will fairly recognize that it's a key issue with implications on our society, so I think the president is right to say it's mission critical. But at the same time, I would warn not to go into mission creep perceptions. So she will have to manage the process, of course. So I cannot prejudge how it will happen. But I'm still in my first point about central banks being omnipotent, being very powerful. In that context, one has to be careful because it's not true. Central banks need to have a good institutional policy framework. And it depends also of the nature of the shock, if you have strong or not strong. For example, basically we distinguish in the ECB with my staff, and it was before me with Otmar Issing already, there are demand and supply shocks. And in all the debate about monetary policy, we thought, the staff thought, this is something which we should put, for example, if you say in a sort of pure inflation targeting, now you have a flexible inflation target, which was closer to what the ECB has been doing. But if you have a supply shock, so you get the tension, of course, because prices go up and output goes down in a negative supply shock. So there, of course, if the central bank is powerful, if the central bank has credibility, very strong credibility, the central bank can look through the shocks, can say, I can tolerate an overshooting of the inflation for a while. It can take some time. I can accept that, an overshooting of inflation, and I will try, to stimulate the economy. If inflation expectations are not well anchored, so the negative supply shock leads to inflation, of course, short term, but if it feeds into wages and all that, and all behavior, so we call it second round effects, then the central bank has to give the priority to inflation and try to keep its credibility and all that. It explains a lot in the hike of interest rate in 2011, I tell you. There's a lot of talk about mistakes that the ECB has done. With hindsight, we can always say there are mistakes, but I can tell you now that when the ECB increased in 2011 the interest rates, that's the increase, I think, in, when was it, April, and then the increase when I came, I think it was September 11, I came in June 11 in the ECB. I was a bit surprised, but I voted in favor of the increase of rates. Inflation was well above 2%. There was a supply shock because oil prices had increased, wages were increased, I forgot now, but I think it was 4% plus. So there was still, in 2011, now with hindsight, we know that it was there was another force in the economy, a negative force that was pushing the economy down. But there was an oil shock, and the Governing Council was still in the spirit that they had to fight against the risk of second round effect. The monetary union was still relatively new, and fighting about what we always had seen, in previous crises, the second round effect of oil price increases, etc. We had that. Realized that in 1999, oil prices were about 14, I think, when the monetary union started, $14 a barrel. And at the peak of the crisis, to 2009, 2008, and then 9, I think oil prices fell. But oil prices were above $100 a barrel. So we had in all this period, a pressure on commodity prices, oil prices, and the ECB, as many other central banks, but the ECB was always worried, in this new union where you still had credibility problems, to be sure there will be no second round effect. The problem in 11 is that there was a banking crisis and a government debt crisis, and that was another force that would push down the inflation, and the judgment at that time was that the first was more important than the second. That was, I think, a mistake. But I think it was a mistake which we understand now why they acted in that way. There was a reasoning which I think was wrong, but I mean there was an analysis behind that, and I think the impact of the banking crisis was underestimated. So you have demand and supply shocks, and then are they permanent, not permanent? Are you credible or not credible in the beginning? Can you look through, etc.? So that's the first thing you have to know. And as I say, the recent criticism about the September decisions of the ECB, so going back to QE and cutting the rates and saying that the rates could go even lower, and having a very strong forward guidance on interest rates, but also asset purchases, my sense was that I would have been a little bit more in a waiting mood, and I would have. All these decisions are very difficult to take, so I would have been a little bit more in the waiting mood than these decisions. So I understand very much why it was so controversial, and do not have time to discuss all this. But it was, as you know, quite controversial. It was not only a question between hawks and doves, the traditional thing, but it was basically, I was considered more as a dove than a hawk, but it was basically to say, is that the right answer to the sort of shock that we have, which is a geopolitical shock, the trade protectionism and the Brexit, fears that we had, and that, these measures would not bring much, to stimulate the economy. They did some, I must confess, they did some, but creates other problems, of course, about the future in policy. So I think it has been controversial, and I think the nature of the shock is something very important. For example, when people say central banks are powerless because of the zero lower bound, for financial shock, panic shocks, I think central banks remain very powerful because we have all the central banks have this power to create liquidity. And in the euro system, the central bank has the possibility to provide liquidity to non-banks, much in an easier way, than in the US, for example. So the counterparties, there's a lot of flexibility in decided the counterparties. So the central bank, in a sort of financial panic situation, the central bank has the tools, to stop a panic, because it can create liquidity in a very flexible way, and we proved that in the past in the ECB. So there, I would say the central bank has still. Now, what we had when people say monetary policy didn't work, I'm sometimes a bit upset about this. I think it worked pretty well when you look at the nature of the shocks. As I said, 11 maybe was a mistake. I think we should not exaggerate the consequence, because the ECB reverted very quickly. But it worked pretty well. But you cannot neglect, and reason like other things being equal. I think when one of the things I was pushing very much in 2018 in the spring, in May, for the meeting of June, was to stop QE. We call it the great rotation, the normalization of instruments. We pre-announce a sort of stop of QE, and we say interest rate and guidance will become the dominant instruments, plus the stock of assets, the management of the stock of assets that you have accumulated, the reinvestment, etc., etc. And I think it worked. We saw, wage starting to increase. The wage Phillips curve was slow, but it was working. The transmission from wages to inflation, we didn't see much, but I'm convinced it was in the pipeline. It would take more time. It's flat Phillips curve and all these things. But what happened, and I don't understand what people don't say that, we had a new shock. I mean, we had the Brexit shock, and we had the Trump shock on protectionists that destroy business confidence. And you see that very clearly on investment sentiment in general. Business investment in general. Not so much consumer, fortunately, but business investment. So you cannot just say, look, you did all these and inflation is not picking up, without thinking there have been a sequence of shocks, all over the place. And that's a new shock. Now, of course, you can say all the shocks have been related, because populism has been the consequence of mismanagement since the beginning of even before the crisis. That's why you get, of course, there is some endogeneity in the shocks. But it's not monetary policy that would have solved that, the rise of populism. You could say, yes, if monetary policy would have been a bit more proactive, do you really believe that the populism that you see in many countries would have been different? Well, at the margin maybe, but not fundamentally. And there are many other issues related to the rise of populism that monetary policy being a little bit too passive, at some time in the last 15 years, maybe. A bit more even than 15 years. So that's my first point. The second point on instruments, and then we go into the review. On the instrument, so we have this fall of the natural rate. It's a trend. And the difference with the debate a few years ago is that suddenly there is a convergence of view among economists, which is, be careful, as you know, maybe they may be wrong. But as a convergence of view, there is something structural, and it could get even worse. And that leads to a debate in the United States, which is a debate which is a bit different from Europe. In the United States, the debate is what are we going to do for the next recession? While in Europe, the debate on the strategic review is to say, is monetary policy working? Is our strategy okay or not okay? And should we change the objective, etc., etc. The US is it's in a way much more simple, because they are more or less at target. They have a double mandate, employment and price stability, and they're more or less, fulfilling their mandate. The question is it stable? Is it sustainable? But now, if you look, they are more or less, at target. The question is, what are they going to do in the next recession, given the fact that the natural rate is still going down, and that nominal rates, at the peak of the cycle is very, very low. So what do you do? This is a debate which is already difficult, but it's for the next recession. While the strategic discussion in Europe is it's make an assessment of the past, and also what do we do in the future. But it's not only what you do in the future, it's also the assessment of the past, which makes the exercise much more delicate than in the United States. And the debate in Europe about the strategic review happens at a time where you don't realize the objective that you have fixed yourself, that you want to attain. So it's a much more delicate exercise. And my view on this, I think, as Christine Lagarde was saying, it was unavoidable. And so you have to do it. Time is never right, she said. I think that she has a good point here. My point when I was in the governing council, because my staff at that time was working on these things. Of course, we were working on these things. But we wanted to come in the public for two reasons. Because first, we didn't want to give a signal. Why do you have a strategic review? Well, we have a strategic review because somehow policy doesn't work. That's why you have a review. If it works, why would you have a review? You could have a review like in the US. It works, and we think about the future. But if you have a review now, it's because it doesn't work. And the sort of chaotic, sometimes, communication of some governing council members would reinforce the view that they want a strategic review to change something because it doesn't work. And so I said, before you do that in the public, you better know what is the issue and what is the solution, more or less. What is the solution you have in mind? And opening a strategic review without knowing exactly where you go, I've personally thought, and I think Mario at that time also thought it was not very constructive at that time. We better start, thinking. Also, when you open a strategic review at a time where you're not really satisfied about fulfilling your mandate, because inflation is not what the ECB wants it to be. When you start that strategic review, it can be good or bad, but I think it's the risk is that you open debate, debating rather than acting. So you debate about the future, about the framework, and why did it work in the past, where did we go, and all that. And at the same time, there may at some point be a need to act. So you can say, while you have this debate, you can just be passive, which is fine. I mean, if the economy continues and stabilizing and improving, in that scenario, it's fine. If you have, of course, a new shock in both ways, well, especially a negative shock, then, of course, a strategic review will be a sort of distraction compared to what you have to do, and put all your attention on what to do or what to do at that time. Now, with a little bit of luck, I think it's fine. If the economy continues like it is now, stabilizing and probably going the right direction, I think it's fine. But you have also to think about not being too much distracted by, what do you do in some circumstances now, not thinking about the longer term. So the question of instruments basically is the natural rate, but I will add something which has to do with the specialness of Europe. That's my third point. So you have the natural rate going down, so you try to bring the monetary rate below, if you want to stimulate the economy. But of course, in Europe, you have an additional problem, is that we don't have a safe asset. And so when you use your interest rate or expectations about future rates, so the more classical thing, not talking about QE now, when you do that, you have a benchmark curve, which basically determines financial conditions in general. So you influence the short-term rates and the expectations about the future rates, and then you get a yield curve, you get a curve, and that influences financial conditions, equity prices, lending rates, and that's the financial sector job, and giving risks, and all that. And the problem, of course, when you don't have one yield curve in Europe, the short end you can control, the expectation about future short-term rates to some extent, to the medium term, you can influence expectations. What is the longer term in Europe when the institutional framework is not very good, I must say. It's better, much better than before because of the ESM, but it's not yet completed. You get for the longer end a big divergence, of course, because of risk between, the Bund, for example, and the Italian BTP, and you get a yield curve which is not one yield curve, for Europe. So you get in difficult circumstances when the institutional framework is not very solid, for crisis management, for example, when there are big differences in debt sustainability, that markets price risk is fine, I would say. The problem in some circumstances, everybody knows that you can have multiple equilibria, and at some point, when uncertainty reaches a certain level, people prefer to run away from one market and go to the other market, and you get big shocks, It's not just a linear thing, it goes from one side to the other, and we went into that before the whatever it takes of Mario Draghi, where you can get, different equilibria, And then it becomes self-fulfilling, of course, because the more people run from one market to the other markets, you get mispricing in Germany and mispricing in Italy. But the more you do that, you destabilize Italy. And you get this vicious circle, like a bank run, you know, and that's what we had in 2012. And that problem has been addressed to a large extent, but it's still there, you know, it's still a risk, it's not gone. On the strategic review, let's be concrete. So there are many things you can put in a strategic review. I put a list just quickly. The first, it's why, I explained already. So why now? And I say there are different interpretations. You remember on the US, it's the future. Here it's, is it because it doesn't work, or, you know, what is the reason? So I will not repeat this. I think the main message of a strategic review, this I want to repeat, is that monetary policy in the euro area cannot work smoothly, I would say, to be polite, cannot work smoothly without deeper integration. Completion of the banking union, the capital market union, and a reinforcement of the ESM, and also putting in place a safe asset, unfortunately. Because it's, I say unfortunately, because it's difficult to do. So that's the main message of a strategic review, I think. It is not to see how you're going to think about your mandate, you know, to look at the operational target, to see if it's below but close to 2% in the medium term, or at 2% or around 2% in the medium term. I think it's important to reflect about this, but this is not the key issue. The key issue of monetary policy working in the euro area, and we should say very clearly, is that the institutional, you know, underpinning of the monetary union is not perfect. It's far from perfect, and you will not. You can play around with your strategic review, you know, in monetary policy. You're not going to solve that. So this is the first message. It's a delicate message. It's a political message, has been given very often by Mario Draghi and others, saying you need more fiscal union, you know, you need I think, banking union, private sector risk sharing, capital market union. But this is not just, these are not just words. This is something which is key. And a strategic review, when you say maybe it didn't work or it doesn't work and the zero lower bound makes it worse, it doesn't work. Well, I think it works pretty well given the circumstances. But it will not work, and with the zero lower bound, it makes the problem more difficult. It will not work smoothly without, you know, deeper, you know, integration, the ones I mentioned. So I think that's the first message in the strategic review. That's not usually what you find, because this is a strong message. Nobody wants to say monetary policy cannot work without a deeper integration. Cannot work. And I said cannot work smoothly without, you know, to be a bit polite, to work smoothly without deeper integration. So in a way it works, you can handle, but not in a very smooth way, at least, I mean. So there is a big policy imbalance in the monetary union that's to be addressed. That's my first point. The timing, Christine Lagarde said 2003, the last one was 2003. I looked very carefully on this. I discussed a lot with the staff who was already there. And it was called a clarification of the strategy. I mean, so I personally would not call it very much a strategic fundamental change in 2003. It was a clarification. And well, okay. So it was a clarification of the target. So what is, you know, what is your objective? 2% below but close to 2%, you know, discussion on this. And also the two-pillar strategy. Nobody mentions that, you know. There was the first pillar was the monetary, looking at money supply, basically. And the second was, of course, the operational target of monetary policy. So that's the timing. And it's by the end of 2020. So that's a relatively short period of time. Well, the process, I think it's important because the scope, and Christine Lagarde said we need to look at all the issues, all and every issue. So that means distributional aspect of your policy. So it's very broad, actually. We will turn each and every stone. And climate is mission critical. So these are the sort of words which have been communicated. And I kindly warn, of course, of the expectation gap, because I can tell you that when you say each and every stone will be turned, I get phone calls and meetings already with people, citizens, saying you need to go from QE to helicopter money, QE for the people, because there is a strong rationale. If you want to support demand, just give the money, print money and give it to the people, rather than to buy, bonds that would stimulate equity prices and we enrich, the rich, the wealthy people. And so when you say there is no taboo, you go into saying, tell us, we don't want to tell you that helicopter money, you should do it, because that's your responsibility, but we would like to know in the Monetary Union framework, if it's legally possible to do that, and say yes or no. Are there legal constraints? As you know, the monetary finance sort of discussion, these people say no, there are none according to them, but they like to have clarity on this, on the toolbox, the extreme conditions. So that's one of the things I hear, and I see these people now, and they come with another thing, which is climate, of course. And if you say climate is also, the domain of the scope, of the review, what sort of expectations do you create? There are the reasonable expectations, I think, and there are also expectations where you can link the helicopter money thing with the climate change financing need, of course. And then you get, things where you have a big risk of overshooting expectations about what a central bank can do. It's not omnipotent, and I think this has to be under control. I think they're very aware in the ECB about this, of course, but I think managing of expectations among the citizens, I think more than capital markets, I think this is something that will have to be managed very carefully, has to be done very carefully. Everybody will be consulted, so I will not repeat, I just said it. Now, on the mandate itself, there is no treaty change, of course. The treaty says price stability. There is no double mandate or triple mandate or quadruple mandate. It's price stability first, so there is a hierarchy. I don't think it will not be changed, because you would have to change the treaty, of course, so it's not going to be changed. And to the extent that the first mandate is fulfilled, you have to support the other policies. Now, so there's no change there. The difference which is context related, if people believe that inflation, given the natural rate discussion and all this, given technology and all this, that inflation is going to be very low, just below 2% for many years, that means that interest rates will be also very low, etc., then you would say inflation is a primary objective, but it's always fulfilled for several years, whatever, for some horizon. Don't worry. So you worry only about the other things. So again, why not in a way? But this is slippery, slope, and one has to be careful about this, because you would say, price stability is not the issue, because in all cases it will be fulfilled for the next 3-4 years, and so you have to focus on many other things of central bank. I think what in the hierarchy, what is very important and which is not debated today, is that the monetary policy of the ECB has always insisted on the medium-term perspective. I mentioned that before, and the medium-term perspective, we have been faced with that very often. When I say, yes, we are directionally right, as Christine Lagarde was saying the last press conference, directionally right for inflation, so it's not satisfactory, but we go in the right direction. Actually, we always said it in the past, just give us a little bit more time, and when we define the medium term, we never want to say like inflation targeter, it's 18 to 24 months or something like this. We say it depends on the nature of the shock. For some shocks, it may take much more time. Now, if you say to reach the inflation target, you need 10 years, it may not be credible in the population. So we have been confronted in 13, 14, in speeches I was making, for example, when I say in the medium term, we're going to reach it. So no, it's not satisfactory, but we are going to get it in the medium term. And then a few times we said in the medium to long term. And then people are joking, you know, what is long term? 10 years, 20 years? So you lose your credibility. What is a medium term? I think the communication should be much more precise there, much more transparent here. What do we mean with the medium term? And one of the things you could say, look, it's going to get time because we had a series of shocks, you know, it was in the right direction, but we had new shocks there. And so it will take time. We're going to, so it's never satisfactory, but I think the medium term thing is a key question here. And how do you communicate on the medium term when you don't? And you don't necessarily need to change the strategy. But I think you need to go much more in the analysis and the nature of the shock and the time it will take. The definition of price stability. Now, this is key. And I see the clock. We are the definition of price stability. There's a lot of confusion. The Governing Council, so the treaty says price stability, so it's 0 in principle. The Governing Council said price stability is between 0 and 2%. That's the definition still today, between 0 and 2%. So it's okay? Now, in 2003, because inflation actually was very low, and there were a discussion about the zero lower bound in 2002, 2003, 1, 2, 3, something. Inflation, because of oil price, was very low. And there, the Governing Council, the definition doesn't change, but we want operationally to be close but below to 2%. And that was a decision of the Governing Council for different reasons. We understand that, the lower bound, all this was the decision, but close to 2%. But the definition was still between 0 and 2%, which in the market interpretation created a problem of asymmetry, meaning that if, you know, your inflation because oil prices go up, would be above 2%, it would be worse than if it was 1.5. So 2.5 would be worse than 1.5 because 1.5 was still in the definition of price stability, 0 to 2. And if you're above, you're outside of the definition. Now the ECB always tried, and it didn't work perfectly, to communicate that you can, of course, always be at 2.5 or even more because we want to reach it in the medium term. So you can overshoot. This is not new. Very often we overshot the objective. So, but the ECB, but the market perception never bought that fully, and the 2011 increase of interest rates confirmed the market's feelings that, you know, there was an asymmetry, that when you're above 2, because it's not anymore in the definition, but the definition is a medium-term thing. But if you're above for a number of months, you know, then you have a hawkish reaction of the central bank. It's worse to be at 2.5 or 3, even temporarily, than to be at 1.5, even temporarily. So there was this asymmetry in perception, very much debated among economists. If you read the ECB stuff work, you will see that it's not. There are some evidence that's true, but it's not very, very strong evidence. There are different papers on this. But, I mean, market perceptions are still there. So that you have to clarify. The problem when people say, and I think that's, for me, I would put a 2%. I would just say in the medium term. I think the medium term is very important. But 2%, that means that you can overshoot, you can undershoot. You tried it in the medium term. Do you need to have ranges around this? The ranges, I think, are, we have that in Sweden. But in Sweden, you very much insist on the fact that the objective is 2. It's not to be above or below, it's 2. Now, it's a recognition that there's tolerance bands, you know, where you say, fine, there can be some deviations because it's impossible for monetary policy to be at target. And there's some of sort of signals, you know, red lines, you know, or orange lines that when you're above, you know, the up or the down, below or up, above, you know, the range, then of course it gives some signal, you know, that you have to be alert, you know, on both sides, symmetrically on both sides. It's difficult to communicate, frankly, especially if you come now, the Governing Council will say it's 2, and we go, let's say, 1.5 to 2.5. In the present circumstances, market will say, they are satisfied with 1.5, so that means they will tighten the policy. So you have to be very careful with that. I don't see what it adds, frankly. I think it adds not much. It adds a risk and confusion. I think what is important is you want to be at 2. You want a medium term, so that means you can be above. Yes, it's not in the definition. It's not satisfactory, but you want to bring it over time to 2%. And And okay, so I'll leave it to them. The question, and I will finish with very quickly with a few things about the toolbox. There is sorry, we'll go through the list very quickly now. Relation with other objective. I'm in a group with the IMF, a sort of high-level panel on central bank transparency. So it will be we are drafting, sort of transparency standards and all that, best practices and all that. One of the points I was making in that group is how do financial stability consideration intervene in the monetary policy decisions? I looked at the minute of the Central Bank of Sweden. There is not much, frankly, on this, and I understand why. But I think it's when there are trade-offs, when you go into the medium term and you have to make trade-offs, between financial stability and price stability. I think it should be much more articulated in the monetary policy decision. It's very delicate because it brings a new dimension. Your priority is price stability, but it must be sustainable price stability. That means that you have to be careful that you don't create too many imbalances. And so that I think that should come much more in terms of transparency about how does it come. In my experience in the ECB, and you can see that in the accounts, which next accounts this Thursday, you can see that in the accounts that financial stability is very absent actually from the discussion actually, which is the reality actually. So how do you bring it in without creating too much confusion within the governing council decision making is a key thing. I think that's one of the important things. The toolbox, as I mentioned, helicopter money. When you open the box where you go, we have the QE, we have the efficiency of instruments. If you wish, I know these things well, I must say. The question of negative rates. First, they were extremely useful in the monetary union because when rates are very low and you think zero is the lower bound, okay? I think it's important to tell you. If it's zero, you go into what we call Keynes, the liquidity trap, because zero, if it can never be lower, think you are a company, you wish to issue long-term bonds, who is going to buy that? Only insurance companies because they're forced to buy long-term, but all the others, that means the traders, the more volatile community of investors are never going to buy something at zero because you can only lose money. If you signal that rates could be even negative, you change totally the dynamics of the market, which happened. So that means the long-term rates were crushed down because we said rates can go negative and even more negative. The problem, in a nutshell, the problem with the negative rates, of course, that the impact on banks and all that, I think that's manageable and it's not the main issue. And I think that is a bit behind the Swedish decision, which I tell you, I had sympathy with the decision, but the situation is a bit different in the euro area, but I had sympathy with the decision of the central bank here. It's the idea that to go negative with the rates for a very long period of time, that rates are very low for a long period of time, I think that looks, something likely. But negative for a long period of time has deep cultural consequences. We have been, I've been in our society educated, time is money. The discount rate is, the risk-free discount rate is positive. And now we say, when you teach money in banking, you say discount rate can be negative. Of course, we understand as economists, we can understand that. But culturally is something which I think it's, for a long period of time, you cannot have that. And it's very difficult to explain. That's why the Swedish decision has been commented with mixed views by saying there's no explanation. It's just to say it's not natural. We don't want to keep it for a very long. So it's better it's not just to create firepower, for the next recession. It is deeper than that. It's just to say we have to normalize that one. And I think the reaction of the markets were okay, when you look at, which was a demonstration, I think that it's, at some point, you have to try to get out of this. The side effects, of course, the monetary policy preparation. I will not go into that, but it was in the ECB. In a nutshell, in the ECB, you see, it is true that 19 central bank governors around the table, plus the 6 of the board. And you can see two sort of models. One is a very model where everybody discussed at the same level, or you have a strong, top-down decision-making process, and there has been criticism, and Christine Lagarde says, well, in crisis situation, probably you need a very strong president top-down because you have to go fast, you have to take, measures which are very unconventional, whatever it takes. You cannot just discuss with colleagues, about this. Mario took his responsibility and used the words, at the time he decided to use the words, and I think he was right to do that. In other circumstances, it's true that you need much more, interactions, and preparation. It takes more time, of course. It's more inclusive, of course. So I think it's quite natural that you go to that things, in terms of crisis have normalized, not in terms of economy, but in terms of crisis, and that you go into a model where there's more interactions, with the governing council, and that's what Christine Lagarde said. I think it's quite natural here. The role of the staff is very important, etc. The voting rules, I warn always, I think it will be unavoidable to give the names of the descending governors when a decision is taken. As was said very often by Mario Trichet, all the governors, Christine Lagarde, when a decision is taken, it should be implemented and communicated loyally and defended loyally. And I have no problem when a governor would say, I had a different opinion, but for these and these reasons, the balancing act was difficult. We decided, the governing council decided this, and you have to defend the decision. But you have the right to say you had a different opinion, because it was anyway a difficult balancing act, but that was a decision. This has not happened, and I think that's key in the communication. So by given the names of the descending governors when the decision is taken, will it facilitate or not? I don't know. This is something that has to be fought. I think it's unavoidable, but I think it's not so obvious in a monetary union, where it's a lot of different countries, of course. And that's linked with the communication. Interaction with other policymakers is key, because if you say we need fiscal, and the communication, I'll finish with that, and the communication was to say, look, if there is no more fiscal expansion to support the economy, then, interest rates will remain very, very low and negative for a very long period of time. I'm not sure this is good communication, because if I'm Minister of Finance, please do. I will decide what I do with my budget, because for years they try to reduce the deficits, and suddenly they are being asked to spend more. And they know, the Minister of Finance, that spending more means not making reforms in healthcare, in pension, and all this. It's not supporting, big infrastructure that's going to create growth later on, but basically just going on with policies which are unsustainable. So when you give the signal to governments they should spend more, they have some incentive. First, many are reluctant because they understand the problems, and they understand that if the public starts to buy that you have to support the economy, they would say just don't reforms, don't healthcare, pension and all this, and don't go into, squeezing, reforming. That means not pleasant, and at the same time use the money to do other things to support, structural growth and all these things. And many governments are incapable, because the majorities are very weak, because these skills in many countries, because of the crisis, have been reduced very much, in terms of pay, in terms of quality of people you have in many administrations. So that's one of the things you see in Germany also. They have the money, but the capacity to come with very a good business plan, for the future is not obvious. It's not only a question that Germany is a decentralized country, but it's the inability of governments to come with a good business plan, and concrete implementation of that. And so I think one has to be careful. And what is the interaction with the other policymakers key? And let me stop here. And thank you.
Thank you. If you move over there, you can even have water.
No, that's fine.
So that was quite a menu of things to discuss. Are there any questions, comments? Yes, John Hassler.
My name is John Hassler. So you mentioned a fundamental problem of central banking nowadays, namely that we have had a trend downwards in the natural rate, and that in combination with the zero lower bound reduces the room for maneuver, in particular downwards, so for stimulating. You qualify that a little bit in the end, saying that maybe we don't have a zero lower bound, we can have negative rates, but you also said that that's problematic, at least in the long run. What you didn't mention is that the natural rate is a real concept. And the zero lower bound and the problems with negative inflation, that's a nominal one. Right? So in between, we have the inflation target. So that creates the simple solution, namely to increase the inflation target, and that one for one would increase the rooms for maneuver and reduce the likelihood that we have to use negative interest rates. I said simple solution, but of course it's not simple. I mean, there are lots of problems with it, potential problems. But don't you think it's time to have a serious international discussion about increasing the inflation target?
Okay, no, this is
Microphone. Yeah.
This is, I think, a fantastic question. Frankly, it's the thing I have on my mind continuously. I debate it with the staff because the natural rate is a real concept. It's the rate at which, you know, when the economy growth at equilibrium and there is no, and when the inflation is at target. Now you can have declining natural rate with inflation. That's basically what you say. And there are a number of countries with a very low natural rate and hyperinflation. A few countries with hyperinflation. And how do you get the two together? I ask the question very often to economists, and I don't get a good answer, frankly, on this. My sense is usually that demand and supply factors have combined. And I know it's maybe not a good thing. It means that suppose you have a demography and productivity shock. So the real rate goes down, but that creates excess capacity, of course, because firms had an expectation gap. They thought, you know, growth would be higher. So there's a big overinvestment somewhere. So you create a sort of output gap. And so there is excess supply, you know, in the economy. And so the natural rate, so the trend, the weakening of growth, in the beginning, it's hidden by the fact that people can borrow on the expectation that things will continue. So that's basically the great moderation years, you know, hiding a little bit the fall of the natural rate. So people borrow. And at some point, the moment it's true, it's there. It means that growth is much lower than what you expected. Then you have a shock. And the shock has a big impact on demand, actually, because unemployment goes up and all this. So there's an adjustment. And so you have a combination where growth is low and inflation is low. And that lasts for a number of years. As I explained it, is not very nice. You know, it's really something which I don't think it's really modeled, because you have demand and supply things. And if that was true, you would have still a lot of output gap visible. And some people say, yes, but we don't measure the output gap correctly, etc., etc. No, okay, let's stop this because we don't have time. But then you say, why isn't a solution to target a higher level? You could do that, but do you really believe that it would be credible? I mean, so you increase a little bit the objective. If you that means that you would have to have much more expansionary monetary policies to make it credible. If you say we go from 2 to 4% in Europe, who would believe that? You cannot even realize you 2%. So if you had to redo it early enough, you probably, and you know, there are a number of US economists saying that you would have to. We made a mistake. We had 2. We should have had 3 or maybe 4%. You know, Krugman and people like him saying that today. Do you think it would help? Because the question of instrument is what it is. So you would have to communicate that when you go from 2 to 4%, you have the tools to do that. Because expectations will only change if people believe that your tools will be efficient to do that. So if you think there is plenty... Now, you could put the other question. Suppose we still would have 5% interest rates, or 4% interest rate, let's say. And then you would say, with weak inflation. And then you would have, you know, cut the rates to try to get 3-4%. Probably it would be easier for credibility than to say we push the rates negative further, low for longer, a little bit QE. So the thing is that we can debate about 4. I mean, and the negative, consequences of having an anchor which is different from the 2%, and the relative price adjustments and all these things. We can discuss that. But is it something realistic to come with 4? Personally, I don't think so. We could have done that before when the inflation targeting model was developed. Maybe there was a mistake at that time. I don't think it would change now. The question of instruments is it's just the inability to get it, to get your 2%. But as I say, in Europe there are a number of shocks. It's not to say that monetary policy doesn't work. I think it started to work, but you have a sequence of shock, and you cannot just neglect that. I mean, the geopolitical shock, things were going the right direction very slowly, but the geopolitical shock, the Brexit, created a business confidence shock, which is very clear. You had the automobile shock that added to that. You had the Chinese shock that added to that, and so I don't think it's more. Other things being equal, I would say monetary policy was in the right direction, but then you get new things coming in. And that's why, if these shocks, abate, and like, protectionist Brexit and all this, you can go back on track. But the question is that this low for long term has consequences on the behavior on capital markets in general. So the day you normalize, it's quite difficult to do. But that's another discussion. Now, what are the solutions now? So you gave one solution, is just to target a higher inflation. I say it's very difficult to do now. We maybe could have done that before. Was not in favor, but I mean, that's open question. The other is all the very complicated strategies that some central banks are going, like the US and maybe Europe, is saying if you undershoot inflation for a while, you have to commit to overshoot inflation. So you have a 2% trend. If you are below, somehow there are different techniques to do that. You have to make up, the underinflation, missing inflation that you had, and just have more in the future. And to try to influence, inflation expectation. It goes a little bit in the direction you have. Is it credible? Is it time consistent? These discussions? I don't know. I think it is a bit of tricks, when you have a big problem of instruments. And so I prefer to put the debate about the nature of the shock than the instrument. But I have to admit there is a problem of instrument. But I prefer. And some people will say, why don't you go for helicopter money? Because there immediately you put money in the pockets of people, and there are different techniques, there are very sophisticated techniques. And you do it directly. The main question is the governance of helicopter money. So how can the central bank still keep its independence? Independence means you decide how much and when the music stops, And once you start, it's difficult to stop because you change also the perceptions of people that money is for free. You write a check, you print money, and people get a check, from the central bank. And that solves the problem. So culturally, it's extremely difficult to do, especially with the public in general. But theoretically, of course, many things can work, of course. But in practice, the political economy of helicopter money are quite dangerous, I think. But all these strategy by saying you can overshoot, actually, we have that. That's what irritates me very often. You can clarify that, which I think the ECB probably will do. But it's a medium term. So we always said, if you undershoot, we want to have in the medium term close to 2%. So you can say in the medium term 2%. Suppose you change. You say 2% in place of below but close. Okay, not a big deal, I think, but okay. So you say 2. If during a while you are below, well, then you have to go back on track, and that means that sometimes you can be above. I mean, that's not new. I think Erkki Liikanen said it very often, that there's no big deal of that, because it's a medium term. No, markets never bought it because of the definition. It's very difficult to change. The letter of Ottmar Issing, Schlesinger, Jürgen Stark, and Hanun and others, this letter that former central bankers wrote, an op-ed, saying, they're against. They are afraid that one changes the definition. Definitions say price stability is up to 2. Just 0 to 2%, not negative, but 0 to 2. And if you go above, but we always said we can go above temporarily, provided you cannot control inflation like this, of course. So I think you have to clarify that. We tried in our communication, it didn't work. And proof is that people say, it's asymmetric, it's asymmetric. And so there will be some clarification, I think that's for sure.
Okay, we have at least 2 more questions, and we have 10 minutes or so. We need a microphone for Peter Englund here. I saw somebody else waving in the back. You have a lot of running to do. We have 3 questions. Could we take those 3 questions sort of in a row, and you can deal with them as you please. Peter Englund, please.
Okay. I'd like to have your view of the relation between monetary policy and macroprudential policy. I mean, with low interest rates, it's natural that people borrow more. And then, at least in this country, you haven't been willing to take the full consequences of that. So you have had counteracting macroprudential policy measures. So my question is, I mean, how should you think of macroprudential policy in a business cycle perspective?
Yeah, no,
okay.
Very good. Very good.
Now, good exercise this morning. All the questions are all in the back. I'm sorry.
Yes, hi. My name is Matthias Sundli. Here's a quick question on, so I understand you correctly. What do you think is the main concern, the main reason why the ECB isn't sort of meeting its inflation target today? Is it supply related or is it demand related? What is today, in your view, the main issue? And the other one, just very quickly, if you can touch upon, there's some ideas floating around about sort of hybrid fiscal expansion, that you would have the ECB participating in some sort of European body instigating some sort of infrastructure spending and so forth, and being financed by the ECB. This would be sort of a shortcut into fiscal expansion.
How would you do that? Finance?
Well, yeah, I'm asking you.
No, but just helicopter money. I mean, that's the sort of thing, no?
Yeah, it's similar to helicopter money, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
More running. Now it's up here.
Good morning, Ludovic Egro, Nasdaq. Wanted to ask you a question in relation to capital market union, actually, and the interaction between monetary policy and capital markets union. You are chairing one of the groups of the high-level group of the Commission Capital Market Union. Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Okay, and we got 6 minutes, so you...
Yes. First, I mean, on the monetary policy macro, I fully with you. I said that in my other high level for the IMF, I made the remark that central banks should be more transparent on how macro financial stability, but also macroprudential instruments intervene in the debate, in the decision-making process. Price stability is not only medium term. Price stability must be sustainable. And so if you have imbalances, different sort of imbalances, you cannot say, I reached price stability. Other policies may be needed. That's why I say, central banks, that was my very first remark. The first thing that central banks should communicate, we are not omnipotent in stabilization policy, sort of Taylor rule summary. And that's one very good example. It must be sustainable. And Jean-Claude Trichet was very often proud, in all his communication that we reached close to 2% in the first 10 years. But it was huge. He was also stressing there were huge imbalances, but that means also that your price stability, and that leads to the second question, that price stability was not sustainable because there were huge imbalances at some point, they materialize. I mean, they unwinded these imbalances in a very stressful conditions because the institutions were absolutely awful to deal with these sort of problems. And so price stability was not sustainable because there were imbalances. There were real imbalances and there were financial imbalances. They are linked always, of course. And when you have weak institutions to deal with that, then you amplify the problem, as with Lehman, but that was with sovereign debt and banking crisis. You amplify the problem. And when that happens, your natural rate goes even lower because your productivity goes down, you have excess capital, and all that goes even lower. Now, what you say, supply and demand, these are related, I don't know if you read the Green Deal, Well, I reassure you that the ECB will not change the mandate. You know, the mandate is close to 2% in the medium term, or it will be 2% in the medium term, will not be 2 degrees in the medium term. So that's, no, but that's, I mean, it's a joke, of course, but it is a little bit what some people start to think about, you know, that central bank can do many things, including debt. That was your question about, the second part of your question about financing the Green Deal. So the objective is price stability, and to what extent should the central bank goes in allocation. What is true when you read the Green Deal document, you should read it. I read it only recently because I went through the press, but I read the document. It reminds me a little bit the Lisbon strategy. You know, in 10 years you are the most competitive country in region in the world in tech and all that. Here it's much more than that. How you're going to do all these things? When you read that, it's a supply shock. It's a supply shock in the making. But you see, it's also demand, because if you say I go from, let's say, private consumption to military spending. You see that happens, you know, countries, you know, go to war, Vietnam War. You go from, and you say fiscal must change, the taste change. We want weapons, you know, and not consumer goods. That's a big supply shock, but it's a demand shock also, of course, because people have bought, you know, things, and suddenly, you know, they have to reassess. You know, I mean, it's, you know, supply and demand shock, they're very much linked. That's why, for example, the protectionism, normally lesser growth and more inflation. We don't see much more inflation because these shocks, you know, create uncertainty, creates, you know, lesser hiring and lesser consumption. So the interaction between supply and demand is quite difficult, actually. The origin is probably a supply shock, but then it feeds into demand at some point, and the central bank, of course, has to deal with that and see what is the part of the shock that dominates in the short term, in the long term. A classical supply shock, like an oil shock, is very easy. Prices go up, growth goes down. And then you look at the second round effect. So we have been educated with all these shocks in mind. Now we have different sort of shocks that can interfere very quickly with demand. And that's difficult to manage. The macroprudential, I think, should be much more in the communication. So how do you put that in the monetary policy decision framework? What I hear from some central banks is that if you don't have enough tools, and you will see the issue, enough tools, the classical tools, monetary, or even the non-standard like QE or forward guidance, if you don't have that, you should maybe look much more on the cyclical aspect of macroprudential policy. That means, you know, there are counter-cyclical capital buffers. You should put them down or up, you know, depending on the cycle. I would also warn very much, I never believed very much in these counter-cyclical buffers. I think you can play the margin, of course. But when things go bad, you know, and saying to the banks you need less capital, you can eat into your counter-cyclical buffer, I'm not sure it makes a big difference. Maybe a little bit, but I would warn very much using macroprudential tools for cyclical business cycle reasons. But some economists have this in mind, to say we can complement the classical monetary or non-standard tools by macroprudential cyclical part. I think macroprudential can play, of course, like some markets, you know, avoiding leverage and all these things. Now, you can say when the housing market is not good, you increase the leverage. You know, people can pay much more, can borrow much more for house prices in the down of a cycle. It's not easy. In the up, it's easier. It's already difficult politically, I know. But technically, when things go bad, saying people can overborrow, when unemployment goes up and there is an uncertainty on the economy, you can say, you can borrow 120% of the value of a home because home prices are depressed today and they're going to go up later on when the economy will recover. I think there is a big asymmetry there in macroprudential. So I would warn about the using that for business cycle reasons. So I'm very much structural, you know, on macro, on financial stability, there's a lot of structural, you know, the classical thing. And then when the shock arrives, I think the central bank has to provide massive liquidity. Well, that's the put story, including maybe for non-banks, asset managers, if there is a run. But there is a big but. When things are what they are, you should prevent them. But when there is panic somewhere, the central bank has to intervene. There is no way. But there is a big but. The next day, you have to come with a very big regulatory agenda, of course, and you cannot just say, I want the moral hazard test to be a second order concern when there is a shock. The UK, you remember, the UK didn't follow that road with Northern Rock. I think you have to act. The question, of course, is the counterparty of this is you have to be very strong on the regulatory part. And so the sector should know that. On the capital market union, it's true we come very soon with the interim report, which would basically set the philosophy, the mindset of the group. I think will not come up with, with concrete, things. No, because all the lobbyists will come, I think. But it will set a little bit I think that it's urgent. There's a sense of urgency for different reasons. Different reasons. A fundamental reason is what I said from the right beginning, is that in an imperfect monetary union, it's already imperfect politically, because we don't have a single budget and all these things. But it's also because we have not a unified capital market in Europe, with a lot of fragmentations and all that. So that means that private sector, that risk sharing is not working well. So in good times you can have some risk sharing. In bad time, things go back to there is a big capital outflows from some countries. And so that means that's not really risk sharing, of course. So you need to develop very much the capital. It's really a priority and urgent. It's something urgent. The second reason why it's urgent, there will be a lot of transformation. Think about the climate change if one does what is in the Green Deal. But many others. So technology, of course. And for that, it's not a classical banking market that's going to finance that. You need much more, equity sort of markets. So it's capital market-based finance, which is the weak part in Europe. So that's urgent because the technological changes are there. And the third reason is that that's sad to say, but it's that... there is the geopolitical dimension of capital markets in general. Using, of course, the dollar as a weapon is a small example. That European institutions are relatively weak, in capital markets, and capital markets should be the future and not the traditional banking market. And so there is a geopolitical aspect in what we call the sense of urgency, and the Brexit you have seen. When you read Mark Carney saying that the city environment should be not necessarily following the regulatory evolutions in the euro area of in the European Union, I think we have to see the competition aspect related to that. And so we thought that in Europe, when you come with a set of rules, standards and all that, because we are big, the European Union is big, you can impose these standards or influence the standards in a big part of the world. That's not necessarily the case. So the first thing, you have to be very united and very strong and not compromise too much, frankly. But you have to be good, of course. But you have to be good. But if you are good, you have good rules and all that, then you have no compromise. And be careful about the free riding. Now, the question in Europe is very difficult because within the European Union, as you know, there is no unity, especially for capital markets. And banking, we start to have that broadly, but not for the capital markets. So you have some countries have been much more performing or aggressive, depending what point of view you take, in attracting capital and developing the capital market base. So at some point you need to put in place a framework that would facilitate the development of capital markets in Europe, and we would have to agree on that. And it's not so simple. Just two things. One is that a lot of barriers come from just business practices, different practices. So there are a lot of frictions just because of history. And then if you change, you harmonize or whatever, it creates adjustment problems. That's difficult to change, of course, but this is manageable. But there are other things also which come from deep cultural, from history, from deep cultural differences, like solvency, securities law, of solvency law, or protection of consumers. And that, if you want to harmonize it, it's much more difficult to do. So there are two sets of barriers, you see. One are deep, and the others are just because of frictions that come from practices and history. So we have to find the priorities because it's urgent, where you can change sometimes little frictions with big consequences. Think about corporate actions, that creates a lot of friction, sense in the wheels, of the settlement process. Well, not only the settlements, the IPO up to the settlement process of securities. So that's one example. So that's one, the barriers. The other is to leverage where you have strength. And there are some strengths in Europe. And the third one is the question, how can you have a framework that facilitates financial innovation in the good sense, of course, financial technology and all that, being always careful about financial innovation, but to have a framework that facilitates, productivity in financial services in general. Think about the use of data, and the framework you create for that, and there are plenty of things there. You know these things, and so there are the barriers with two sets of barriers. I would say there is the last one is leveraging on your strength, and there was another one which is basically creating a framework, a friendly framework for the development of capital markets. Banking union would be part of that.
Peter, we have run out of time. You have covered lots of ground, and there is still lots of ground to be covered. So next time in Stockholm, we would love to listen to you again, but we have to put a stop here now. Thank you very much.